How do we stop the Tory party? Is it possible to stop the Tory party? Could Nigel Farage be Prime Minister? Well, the way things are going at the minute, anything seems possible. And of course, we've all been caught up in enthusiasm before and been over-optimistic and been very, very badly let down. And that's been my issue right the way through this election campaign. However, something changed on Tuesday night. Matt Goodwin broke polling data on GB News on Tuesday night that put the Reform Party at 24% in the polls. That really, if that's true, that really is a game changer. Now, obviously, polling data seems to have a massive variance at the minute. Some polls are putting Reform on 14%, but this one that puts Reform on 24% is the most recent polling data they've had since the launch of the Reform, well, they're not calling it the manifesto, the Reform contract with the people. Now, anyone that's watched my podcasts and my videos will know that I am not a Reform fanatic. I'm not caught up with the Reform euphoria. And I'm very, very suspicious of Nigel Farage. So when I'm saying this, I'm not coming at this as someone who's looking at all this through rose-tinted glasses. I'm trying to look at this as a realist. I think the reality is that everybody has got to understand is the Conservative Party in its present form is completely toast. It's finished, it's over, it's done. On the right, the Conservative Party are getting shredded by Reform, and on the left, the Lib Dems are making big gains into their vote on the left. So that there isn't going to be a Conservative Party after this election, which in the long term may be a good thing. In the short term is going to deliver us a massive and extremely dangerous Labour majority, unless there can be some really clever lateral thinking by Nigel Farage and Reform and by the right of the Conservative Party. And we know that Suella Braverman, and there's probably stuff going on in the background that mere mortals like me don't have a clue about. But if Nigel Farage and Suella Braverman teamed up and Suella brought right-wing Tory MPs that agree with her ideology and obviously agree with Nigel Farage's ideology and got them to defect before the election, it would do two things. It would save those right-wing Tory MPs. Do they deserve to be saved? Some of them probably not. But some of them, certainly like Suella Braverman, would be an absolute asset to Nigel Farage. Now, what do you think about this? If Nigel Farage was genuinely polling 24% or more on a consistent basis, or even up to 30%, because now there's momentum. Once he's getting 24%, I'm going to tell everyone to vote Reform now. And I've been very, very shy about doing that simply because of the horror story of having a massive Labour majority in the House of Commons. However, this is the game changer. If Farage manages to get Reform up to 30%, now none of this is without problems, because one of the problems that we've got, none of these Reform candidates have any experience in Parliament. We don't really know who any of them are. And unfortunately, the vetting process seems to have been problematic, to say the least. Putting all that aside, if Farage gets up to 30%, it means he will get seats in Parliament. Some are saying up to 100 seats in Parliament. It could be more than that. So he will become the opposition. Ideologically, he's already the opposition. If Braverman and a cohort of Conservatives, and I think Rees-Mogg would be excellent, but Rees-Mogg is a Conservative loyalist in terms of the Conservative Party, unfortunately, which is, it means that he's very, very ethically driven and he doesn't want to walk away from his team. But the reality is, if Rees-Mogg and people like him joined with Reform now, with 2 weeks to go, it would be a total game changer. And you could see a con-Reform pact where Reform would have to be in the driving seat because they're the ones with the momentum. And the right-wing Tories, the Brexiteers and the Tories that basically believe what we believe, and there are some in there, there's no doubt about that, if they all came on board with Reform and joined Nigel's army, you could be in a situation where that, even if it was only 24%, that 24% could get up to 30, 35, even 40% if that happened. And it gives Reform a lot more credibility as well. Obviously, most people on the right are voting for reform, some out of desperation, some out of enthusiasm, some because they just want to stick one on the Conservative Party. But what reform's also got to do, as well as trying to get those Conservative MPs to come across to reform, they've got to go after the red wall seats that are going to fall back into the hands of Labour. Because if reform can have a massive showing in the red wall seats, all the ones that voted Brexit, and if you're thinking of voting Labour, and I've got to be careful what I say, I was quite insulting about people that vote Labour yesterday, and that's not fair because voters are voters. I don't understand how anyone could vote Labour, but I'm not going to go down that road. But if you're a Labour voter and you supported Brexit, you should be switching your allegiance to the Reform Party, because the Labour Party, reading between the lines, we're going to be back in the EU in all but name, EU only, or whatever the thing we used to say about Brexit. They're going to be back into the EU, and it won't be obvious, but it'll be alignment. So to save Brexit, to save the country from all the monstrous policies that communist, Islamist, greenist, horrendous party are going to push upon every citizen of this country, the only way to save the country from that now is to vote reform and to get the right-wing Conservatives to join reform. So Nigel Farage has to do something, Suella Braverman and her people have to do something, and they need to make it happen, where right-wing Tory MPs come to reform, they defect before the election, and Farage, with that rump of MPs, gets the vote over 35%, and then is a real challenger. And if it got even higher, and they got real momentum in the next 2 weeks, could reform and the right wing of the Conservative Party actually win the election? Now that would be a miracle. People didn't think we'd get Brexit. Well, we didn't. But the reality is the British people voted for it. And the British people may well see an opportunity here, exactly the same as they did in the Brexit referendum, to stick it on the elites that have literally screwed them over for the past 50 years. So that's my thoughts. Right-wing Conservatives join with reform. Labour voters in the red wall seats start voting reform. Farage keeps pushing ahead with what he's doing. And again, obviously it's not going to happen before the election. And if reform did get power, it wouldn't happen because reform wouldn't need to do it. But there does need to be a reconciliation between Nigel Farage and Tommy. And it isn't Tommy that has to apologise. In fact, Farage still needs to apologise to every single working class Brit that he insulted back in 2018. I'll be honest with you, I don't trust Nigel Farage. I'm being brutally honest. But at the moment, would I vote for reform? Would I vote for Nigel Farage if I was in England? Again, like I've said before about the Conservatives, through gritted teeth I would. I like a lot of the stuff they've got in their manifesto. I didn't like what they were doing with net zero migration. They've taken that out. It remains to be seen how things develop. I think realistically the best we can hope for is Farage and right-wing conservatives getting a good number of seats. If right-wing Conservatives and Nigel Farage get 200 seats, that would be a massive, massive result. It's massively unlikely. The likelihood is we are going to have this Labour mega majority and Farage is going to be somewhere around 10 to 20 seats, unless this momentum that's growing at the minute really builds. And if it really builds, maybe Nigel Farage will be the next Prime Minister and we're going to see the King and asking if he can form a government. We shall see.